Okay, I'm going to start here just because I do have a lot of information to cover. So, as most of you guys know, we got this new Canon T4i camera last year, and it happens to be the same camera that I own, and I spent a lot of time getting familiar with it and practicing with it. So, I know how intimidating this can be if you're not familiar with them. So, I kind of wanted to give everyone a rundown of kind of the basic controls, what the camera was capable of that our other camera was not capable of. And then kind of give you a couple just basic photography tips that even if you don't use them for work, you might be able to take them on your next vacation or something. So first off, what is an SLR camera? It stands for single lens reflex, and there's a diagram there that kind of shows you how these things are built. And as you see, there's the lens, and inside the lens there's a series of mirrors. That green diagonal line is called the reflex mirror. Then there's a couple other mirrors up on the top. And so when you're looking through the eyepiece here, or the viewfinder, that kind of, what you're seeing is the image kind of coming in, bouncing around a couple mirrors, and then giving you a preview. On the back wall of the camera, there's the vertical line with the dots. That's called the sensor, and that's kind of the equivalent of what the film would be in an older camera. And in front of that is the shutter, which is kind of just a wall that's blocking any light from hitting the sensor or film initially. So then when you go to take a picture, the mirror, the reflex mirror, flips up. The shutter opens, the image goes to the film or the sensor, then it shuts, the mirror goes down, you kind of repeat the process. So that's kind of where the name comes from, that you have a single lens that gives you a preview and is used for the picture. Then you have a reflex mirror that is inside. And that kind of explains why these things are so big, is because there's actually a physical mirror that flips up and down while you're taking the picture. So even though they're pretty complicated, they do have a lot of these automatic modes that still work the same way as any of your other compact cameras work. I won't spend a lot of detail or a lot of time on these, but on the top of the camera here there's a dial, and you can kind of see it highlighted there. All these modes are pretty much the camera's going to do all the work for you. If you go to take a picture, you don't have to control many of the settings. You just, you might have seen some of these, like the landscape or the sports mode or macro. So, those are ones that are going to be pretty easy to use, even if you don't want to get into any of the manual settings. One I'll go briefly through is the full automatic, and that's that green A. So if you decide to use the auto mode, if you look through the viewfinder, you're going to see this pattern kind of overlaid what you're looking through. And what that is, those are the focus points for the camera. So that's kind of where the camera's going to be looking at those points to try to find something to focus on. So what you do is you hold the button halfway down. I'll kind of give you an example. And one of these points is going to light up. You're not going to be able to look through the eyepiece, but you kind of hear that little beep. What that means is it found something to focus on. And in the example there's the red box over the woman's eye. And so when you're looking through here, you'll see a little red flashing light at the same time that it beeps, and that means that's kind of what it's going to be focusing on. And so if you think that's right, or that's what you're trying to focus on, you after it beeps, you kind of continue pressing it, and then you actually take the picture. So if you hold it and it beeps and that's not what you want, you haven't taken the picture yet, you can kind of let go and try it again and take another picture. As you notice, if it needs a flash, it'll kind of pop up on its own. So it's pretty basic stuff for taking your own picture. If you want to zoom, some of the compact cameras, they have a little button on the back. For these, you actually have to use the physical zoom ring that's built into the lens. This particular one is called the 18 to 135 lens. You'll see some numbers here on the barrel. And basically, SLRs don't really go in terms of a 5 times zoom or 10 times zoom. They kind of refer to the distance that the lens is away from the sensor. So in layman's term, though, basically when it's at 18, that's kind of like a 0 times zoom. It's going to be your wide shot. If you go all the way to the 135, that's zoomed out as far as you can go, and that's about a 7.5 times zoom. So just if you're trying to figure out what those numbers are, that's what they're talking about. And then this other ring is a focus ring. Usually you're going to have autofocus. It's going to work fine for you, but there are some situations where the camera has a hard time focusing on the right thing, and you might need to kind of do a manual override. So I kind of called out there's a little button here that says AF, MF, and the AF is autofocus. If you switch it to the MF, it's going to go to manual focus, and then you're going to start having control of focus on this little ring here. A situation where you might want to do that is maybe you're at a construction site, and there's a chain link fence, between you and what you're trying to take a picture of. If you try to autofocus, it might try to lock it on the fence and not what's beyond it. And no matter how many times you try to refocus it, it might just keep picking up what's in front of you. So that's one situation you might want to switch it over and actually, kind of override it, tell it to focus on what's behind it.
Okay. So for those many focal points, can we change which point to focus on? Yeah, you can if you want. By default, it's going to look at all of them. You can actually go. In the settings here, I'll see if you. Well, I don't know if you can do it in auto. I think in auto it'll just find whatever one it wants. Oh. But if you're in manual mode, if you press this button here, you can kind of change what dots those are. And you can actually just touch if you want to do one or the other. If you hit this little zoom button, you can kind of say, I know I want it to do the one on the left, and it's going to automatically look over there. But by default, it's going to, if you just press the middle, it'll kind of have all of them. It says it's going to search for whatever. You might see multiple. If there's things that are same distance away, it might have 2 or 3 flashes at the same time. But yeah, I think in auto mode, it'll just do all of it. But if you start doing the manual modes, then you are able to actually pick which one you want. And then another button on here that, as you saw, the flash popped up on its own on auto. But if you take a picture and the flash doesn't pop up and you feel that you want to, all you have to do is there's a little lightning bolt here, and that'll pop it up and it'll force the flash. So even if the camera doesn't think you need it, if you decide you want it, you can just do that. And anytime it's up, it's going to flash. So, and the same thing, if you take a picture and it pops up with the flash, and you want to take another picture, even if it doesn't need the flash for your next picture, you need to actually push it down because it's going to keep firing. As long as it's open, it's going to fire every single time. So if you take one picture and it needs it, doesn't necessarily need it for the next one. So you want to kind of push it down when it's done. Believe it or not, there's actually a right way to hold these things. Because they are a little bit bigger, especially if you're zoomed out here. A lot of people are used to holding their cameras like this, and it can get a little wobbly because you have the long barrel. So the way you're supposed to do it is kind of get a good stance. You're going to actually want to use your left hand, kind of put all the weight in your left hand, and then you're going to use your right hand to work the controls, the shutter, and then look through the eyepiece. And not only is that going to give you good stability, but your left hand is kind of right there to do all the zooms if you need to use that. And then your left hand is there for to do those zooms, and then your right hand is there for all the other buttons, all the controls in the back and all that. So it kind of just makes sense to hold it that way. And again, it's going to help with your stability too, because as you see later, some of the settings you're going to really need to have a steady hand if you want to get a good shot. So if you don't want to use the eyepiece there, you can still use the what they call the live view on the back. So in the back here, there's this button that looks like a little camera, and when it's on, you can go from the menu to a live view, which is just going to give you a picture of what it's kind of works the same way as like an iPhone or something might. And it's pretty similar if you want to take a picture that way. When you take the picture, you're going to see these brackets around the side. You kind of just frame your shot. Same thing, you can hold the button down. It'll find something. It'll be, in this case, you're just going to have some green boxes around whatever it feels it's going to focus on. And if you like that, you just continue pushing the shutter down, and it's going to take the picture for you. And this one does shoot video as well. And if you want to shoot a video, on the top here by the power button, there's a little video camera logo, so you just switch it to that. And the only thing that's a little bit different is that you push this live view button to start and stop recording. You don't use the actual shutter button. So it actually took me a little time to figure out when I first got this. I kept hitting the shutter button and couldn't figure out why I wasn't recording. So if you do need to do that, it's both starts and stop with that, and it'll have a little timer on top. So easy enough for that. So any questions on just the basic auto modes? I just kind of wanted to show you guys how to use it if you didn't want to get into anything else. Is there anything else that seemed confusing there? No? Okay. So there are a few problems with auto modes, which is why it can kind of have some benefits to use the manual. And the first one is that the auto mode only really cares about getting a good exposure. So in the top example there, you have 2 pictures that are both even, probably lit about the same way, but there's definitely a different look to them. And in auto mode, the camera kind of decides what that look is. If you go to some manual modes, you kind of have some control over that. If there's a particular look you want to have for your picture, you can also misread dark and light colors for a light, either light or lack thereof. So in this first picture, it's a picture of a freshly paved parking lot, And it might seem normal to you, but the camera's actually seeing all that black and assumes it's dark, so it's actually brightening it to kind of a grayish color. You see this picture below where if you actually correct that, you get that true black, but in the first one in the auto mode, it just assumes that's darkness, and it doesn't realize that it's actually supposed to be black. And it can kind of do the same thing if there's a lot of white in your picture. So these are things that you can kind of control if you go into the manual settings, that you're going to just get a little bit more creativity with your photos. So when I'm talking about the manual control for the exposure, there's three main controls that you can control with these, or three main settings that you have control of, and those are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And all of them kind of control the amount of light that comes into the camera in their own way, but there's also kind of side effects that affect the kind of artistic look to the photo. So I'm going to go over each of these three individually, kind of show you how they affect the light coming in, and then also what effect they have on the picture, and just kind of explain the concepts. And then after that, I'm going to kind of show you where the buttons are to control these if you decide you want to try to do this. But I'm just going to try to explain the concepts first. So the first one's shutter speed, and going back to the diagram, like I mentioned, you get the sensor in the back of the camera there, and you have the shutter that blocks the light and it kind of opens up and closes. And shutter speed is basically just how long that shutter is going to be open to allow the light to come through. So as you can imagine, the longer that shutter is open, the more light, more time it is going to, there's going to be for light to pass through and hit that film or hit the sensor, and it's going to make it brighter or darker depending on how you adjust that. So it's pretty straightforward in terms of how it works for letting more or less light in. But there's also a couple effects you can use for that, and motion blur is one of the effects. So if something's moving while the shutter's open, you can get blurry lines. I'm sure all of us have seen this in one way or another. If you're going out to do a sign survey, maybe you take this picture, a car happens to go by, and you get a blurry vehicle, and in that case, maybe it's not a big deal. But if you're in a situation where you want everything to, you're going to have cars in the pictures, and you want to make sure none of them are blurry, you can, if you had control of that, you can manually speed up the shutter speed and freeze the motion. So here's a picture of some NASCARs, which are going probably close to 200 miles an hour, and they're still tack sharp because this photographer sped up the shutter speed fast enough to freeze that motion. So that's one thing you can kind of control, the two different varying degrees of it. But it's not always a bad thing to have blur. If you use it the right way, you can actually kind of use it creatively. Here's a couple of pictures where someone used a longer exposure and kind of allowed things to blur, have that motion blur, and it's done in a creative way where it actually looks like an artistic picture there. So the first one is shot done at night, and it might be a 5 or 10 second exposure, and then the tail lights and the headlights turn into lines versus little spots, so that can be kind of a cool look. And then the bottom one there with the Buckingham Fountain, a long exposure is something that people use a lot with waterfalls or fountains. Kind of gives that water the misty look versus kind of freezing the water, because it is something that's in motion, and you want to try to portray that motion in the picture, and that's one way you can kind of do that. The only thing is you need to have a tripod for these shots, and if you do anything on a longer exposure, I'm not sure, do we have a tripod? No. So we can get them cheap, but I found one at a thrift store for like $5, so we can probably pick one up if we need one, if someone wanted to do some kind of shot like this. But it's...
The bottom one, probably, I think Photoshop, right?
What was that?
The bottom one?
No, that's actually just a single picture. They may have adjusted, brighten the colors or something, but no, that's all. Because if that was, let's say that's a 5 or 10 second exposure, the clouds are probably moving at the same time. The water's moving, that's why it kind of turns into the mist, and then it has enough time to absorb all those kind of colorful lights from throughout the city. So that's probably just a single picture. That's not besides maybe brightening something up. But if you don't have the tripod, you can easily get some camera shake, which is kind of another bad motion, and I'm sure all of us have done something like this. Yeah. So that's the benefit of a tripod. It does become pretty useful, especially if you're not you're doing something in low light or at night. And if you don't have a tripod, you can still get away with something. If you find like a ledge, you might be able to find like a little ledge or a park bench, or if you have a bean bag, people put those on something to kind of balance it. So there are ways around that. You don't actually need a tripod if you're out and you're trying to do something like that. There's ways around it. And not always going to get the angle you want, but you can use something else if you need to. So when you're using shutter speed, you just want to remember that it does affect the light. You can change it one way or another, but there are two different looks you can get. And this is just another example with the water, where Now you can freeze it if you want, but you can also kind of get that motion look, and they're both about the same brightness there. So you kind of got to decide if that makes a difference in the look you want in the photo, and that kind of helps you decide which shutter speed you might want to use. And here's just a chart that kind of just gives you, usually the shutter speeds are going to be in fractions of a second. So this is kind of just a chart if for reference later on, if you're trying to figure out what setting you might want to start on. So if you want to freeze action, go handheld. 1/50th of a second in general is kind of like the cutoff where they say you don't really want to go much slower than that without a tripod, because that's just kind of the average person has a hard time, even though it seems like a very short amount of time, it is enough to kind of to blur a little bit. So about 1/50th of a second is where you're going to want to start using the tripod. All right, the second one is aperture. And okay. The shutter, we'll go over settings later, but if you're in manual mode, it's going to be the top setting there. And I will, like I said, I'll kind of go over the back, like where the controls are after they don't really make sense here yet. But it is just going to be this top number here, and you'll use the dial. The second one is aperture, and that is actually something that's built into the lens, and you guys might recognize this from the James Bond movies or something. But it's basically just it's the shades that kind of open and close to control the size of the opening that the light comes through and gets into the camera. And again, that's a factor of the lens. So different lenses might have different maximum apertures. The real expensive ones let more light in than the cheaper ones. But the large aperture obviously is going to let in more light than a small aperture. This one is actually, I'll admit, this is one of the harder concepts to grasp just because of the way they value it. As you see, the f2 is a larger opening, and the f22 is a smaller one. And it's kind of a reciprocal. It's like the focal length over this number. So when you know it's a fraction, it kind of makes sense. But when you're looking on the camera, it's just going to say f2 or f8. So it's just something. Again, it's not something I expect you guys to memorize. It took me a while to kind of really get comfortable with it, but that is one thing to keep in mind. But the smaller number is actually giving you more light. And the effect that this has is it's going to affect your depth of field. And this is actually probably the most commonly used artistic effect that professional photographers use. And what depth of field is it's the distance between the nearest and furthest object that are in focus. So as you see in the diagram there, you can, in one extreme, you can take a picture where you have one object that's in focus and what's behind it in front of it are both blurry or out of focus. Or you can switch it and kind of have everything in the photo in focus. And that's something that that's pretty much the main control that's going to give you. If you see a nice photo from a professional photographer, usually they're going to be using a shallow depth of field, and it's going to give it that real artsy look. If you look at maybe a wedding photo or a picture of a baby or something like that, that's an effect that's pretty commonly used. So the situation you might use the different kind of extremes of this is for a large scene, for a landscape, you're going to want everything in focus. So in this situation, you have a picture of a bridge, and you can kind of see the entire scene. You have the mountain range and the bridges in the background. Those are probably miles away, and yet you can still get a fair amount of detail with that. And that's going to be, and that's ideal because you kind of want to show the entire scene. If you want to do more of an artistic shot, though, you might change the aperture, kind of blur the background a little bit just to draw the attention to the one thing that's in focus in the picture. In this case, there's the hat there, and then the construction site, which is maybe 50 to 100 feet away, is already out of focus. As you see on the other extreme, you have things that are miles away that are pretty clear.
It's like the auto macro shot. It's kind of more like that.
Yeah, because they kind of know you're going to be closer up, and it kind of
the blurrier background.
Yeah, and that's what some of those auto modes kind of affect the aperture. Like if you do a landscape, it's going to automatically know you're going to want all these things in focus. So, some of these, obviously all those settings do change these things. It's just a lot of people don't really know what. They know they're taking a picture of a landscape, but they don't really know what controls you're going to want for it. So, but that's like when you do it in landscape mode, it's going to go, give you a picture more like that top one, where it's going to kind of it's going to sharpen the picture a little bit and give you a little richer colors, and it's going to keep everything in focus there.
F2, right?
No, actually, the top one is going to be F22. It's going to be that. This next here is kind of shows you what they are. So. Again, that's why this one's a little bit confusing to grasp. But so the low numbers are going to have a low, a few items in focus, and it's called a shallow depth of field. And the high numbers are going to have a lot of things in focus. So in that regard, it makes a little sense. The low numbers is very little in focus. The high numbers is a lot in focus. But as with the picture there, you can kind of see that those lower numbers also have a larger opening. So again, this is one. It's a really cool effect, and a lot of people use it. It just when you try to get the relationship between the effect and the amount of light, that's the only way where it's a little bit backwards. And this is a cheat sheet that I use, and I kind of told this to my wife, and she thought this was helpful as well. Is that with the low numbers, you want to use that when you want less in focus or there's very little light, and that's kind of the correlation is those low numbers, that f2. As you can see there in the picture, there's only one of the blocks is in focus, and you'd use that in a situation where you have low light. So that's kind of the way to help me remember that. And then you want to use a high number when you want more things in focus, and there's plenty of light to go around. But you don't really necessarily have to memorize this stuff. No one's going to be an expert leaving today, but I just kind of want to show you the artistic effect you can do from aperture, and this is something you have control of with these manual modes. The third thing is ISO, and this is just the camera's sensitivity to light. In the film days, you just put a more sensitive film in the camera. With these digital cameras, you just turn up the setting. And it's pretty straightforward. The higher the ISO, it starts at 100 to 200. It actually doubles every time you turn it up one click. But the higher the number, the brighter the picture is going to be. The only problem with this is that you start losing quality when you start turning up the sensitivity. And the reason for that is that the camera needs to absorb the light real quick, and it's going to have to store it at a lower quality, and you start getting graininess, or in the digital term they call it noise. So if you absolutely need to, you can turn the ISO up and get some pretty good shots in dark situations. But ideally, for our uses, you're really not going to want to use any high ISOs. And this is just for our use for engineering. You're going to pretty much want the clearest shot you can, so you don't want to just rely on turning your ISO real high and then using any shutter speed or aperture you might be able to. You kind of have to work the other settings first, and at kind of a last resort start working this turning up the ISO. And this chart here kind of shows a couple different, the same shot with different ISO levels. And since I have the same camera, I realize this kind of matches up pretty well with how these cameras perform for this particular model. Is that you can kind of go up to about 800 and get a reasonable shot, but anything over 800, it's going to start losing quality pretty quickly. And that's just this is an entry level camera. If you start buying those $5,000 cameras, you can turn them up a lot higher. But with this camera, about 800 is probably about the most you want to go, unless you absolutely have to go higher. So those are the three settings that you have control of in these modes, and they kind of all work together. And just while basically they call this the exposure triangle when you put them all together to kind of come up with this ideal exposure. And when you have a right triangle, it's going to give you, it's not going to be too bright, it's not going to be too dark, it's going to be just right. But you just need to remember that they're all kind of linked and related. So if you decide that you want to change one of these settings for like an artistic reason, you're going to have to change another one to kind of offset that change in light that you just made with the first one. So one example here is, let's say you take a picture in auto and it gives you an aperture of f8, ISO 100, and shutter speed of 1/200th of a second. And you decide, and that's going to give you a proper exposure. If you want to change the aperture because you want that blurry background, you might want to turn it down from 5.8, or from 8 to a 5.6, and it's kind of like pushing that triangle over because you change that one setting. So now the picture's going to be unbalanced. It's going to be either too bright. In this situation, you're letting more light in, so it's going to be too bright. And so you're going to need to do something to offset that to keep it at the proper exposure. So in this case, you're going to want to maybe increase the shutter speed. Since you let more light in with the aperture, you're going to have to reduce the light with your shutter speed. So again, if you're not going to need to be experts on this, it's just something to keep in mind if you start using these, that they are kind of linked. If you change one setting, you're going to need to kind of compensate with another one. And here's just some examples of if you go over or underexposed, that you kind of want to go for the middle there. And if you don't compensate, you might get one extreme or the other. And here's kind of a cheat sheet that kind of shows the three different settings and the different effects. The aperture goes from very little in focus to a lot of things in focus. Shutter speed goes from freezing action to giving you blur, motion blur, and then the ISO goes from a grainy picture to a nice crystal clear picture. So, is there any questions on the concepts of what these things do? I know I'm going to go over the setting, like the actual buttons here. But is there any questions on any of that? No.
So, the ISO with the highest setting would be best using the brightest light, looking for most detail.
No, the ISO, you're going to want to go with the lowest number. Like 100 is the lowest ISO number. So it's kind of if you want to think of it, it absorbs the light a little bit slower, but it's going to be more true, more detail and everything. If you need to absorb it quickly, it's going to kind of lose detail because it just, kind of like if you think of transferring a file or something like that. If you want it to transfer fast, you're going to need to shrink it down, and then you lose quality. It's kind of the same thing, where if you want that information to transfer fast, you turn it up, so it's going to be able to absorb that light, but it's just you're going to lose detail. You're going to get that graininess. So it's ideal to keep it actually, keep the sensitivity lower for better quality.
But you still want to increase it when it's dark?
Yeah, if you absolutely need to, yeah. It's just more ideal to, I guess, use the aperture and shutter speed if you can. Kind of get it right that way, and kind of try to keep it at the ISO as low as possible. And then if you kind of have the shutter speed as low as you can get it without getting blurry, and you have the aperture as wide as you can get it without, as high as the lens will allow you to go, and it's still too dark, then you can kind of go and start changing your ISOs and up it to wherever you need to. So I already went over the automatic modes. These other ones that you see highlighted there are the what they call creative modes, and those are the modes that are going to give you some control over these settings. The first one is the M is the full manual mode, and that's where you can control all three of these settings, and the camera doesn't care how your picture turns out. Whatever you put in there, it'll take the picture like that, whether it's too bright or too dark. So it's a fun one to learn. It takes a while. It's not a lot of situations where you're going to need it, but if you want to do everything yourself, that's the way to go. But and I'll go over one situation where you might want to use it, but in most cases, it's not something any of you will use right now. The AV is called aperture value priority. Now, this one and the TV are probably, if you want to get into using these modes, these are probably the two that you'd be most interested in. So the AV is where you basically control the aperture. If you say you want that blurry background, you just turn the aperture down, and the camera is going to do the rest of the settings for you. So it's kind of like a semi-automatic mode. So you pick that one effect, the camera's going to adjust the shutter speed, ISO, and all that, and give you a good picture. So it kind of gives you a little bit of control, but takes some of the thought process out of that. And then the TV stands for shutter or time value priority, and that works the same way except for with shutter speed. You just pick the shutter speed. You say, I want the cars to be nice tack sharp. I'm going to put 1/500th of a second, and the camera's going to make sure that the picture comes out right. So those are the two that are used most commonly. I know, like wedding photographers, people that are professionals, sports photographers, they use one of these two settings. That's pretty much what they do, because they just don't have time to try to think of all the settings, and it kind of lets you choose the effect you want, but you don't have to think about setting everything else, because lighting conditions can change, and you don't have to keep playing with everything. It'll still give you a good picture. And then the P is the program mode. I don't really use this much, and it's, from what I've read, it's not the most common mode, but the gist of it is that if you go to take a picture, it's going to start you with the settings that it would give you in automatic mode. And then if you change this wheel here on the top, basically if you turn to the left, it's going to change your shutter speed. If you turn to the right, it's going to change the aperture. And it's going to kind of adjust everything for you. So it's going to basically start you in what it would think it would be right in auto mode, and you adjust yourself. But again, I don't have a lot of familiarity with it, and it sounds like a lot of other. It's just not one that's commonly used, but that's what it does if you decide you want to play around with it sometime. So if you decide you want to use these manual modes, this is what the screen's going to look like. The M there on the top left, it tells you the mode you're in, so it's in manual mode. That number there is going to be your shutter speed. In this case, it's 1/80th of a second. And that number there is going to be your aperture value. This one's going to be at f8. And like I said, it doesn't have the slash there, so you kind of have to, it just says the F and the number. And then your ISO value is going to be right there on the upper right. Now, if you see around the 1/80th there's those little arrows that are kind of bracketed around it. What that tells you is that by default, this wheel here on the top, there's this little wheel. that's basically telling you that at that moment, the wheel is going to control that setting. So if you, by default, if you're in this mode, if you just change this, you're just going to be changing the shutter speed. If you decide you want to change the aperture, there's the AV button there on the top. You would hold that down, and then that bracket's going to switch over to the, kind of those little yellow arrows are going to be around the F8. And when you hold that and then use the wheel, that's how you would change the aperture. And I didn't put this here, but there's a little button that says ISO on the top. If you want to change the ISO, you just press that button, and the controls come up to pick the ISO you want. Below that is a light meter, and when you kind of go to focus to take a picture, when you get that autofocus and it beeps, it's going to kind of scan the light, and this light meter basically kind of tells you what the camera thinks as far as your settings, whether it's too bright or too dark. And you see that there's a little tick mark there on the bottom, on the left side between the 1 and the 2. That number's going to be bouncing around, or that little dot's going to be moving around, telling you what you're, kind of like a preview of what you're going to get with these settings. So in this case, if it's to the left, it's going to be too dark. If it's to the right, it thinks it's too bright. If it's in the middle, it thinks it's just right. So in this case, the camera's telling you that with these current settings, it's probably going to be a little bit too dark. So you don't need to just take picture after picture and see if, tell that way. You can kind of get a preview with this light meter before you just take 20 pictures to get the right setting and kind of get it in the ballpark, and then take a picture and see if it works out for you. And then if you want more control of the settings, the Q there on the bottom is the quick menu, and that's going to open up all these settings. I'll kind of show you here. If you press the button, all these they're going to kind of open up, and this is a touch screen, so you can kind of touch any of the settings, and when you touch it, you can kind of if you want to control shutter speed, you can kind of move it around, get whatever shutter speed you want, and then go back. And while you're in this quick menu, any of these are going to be available for you to kind of touch and control and work that way. So if you don't remember what the dials do, you can just press the quick menu there, and all the settings become touch responsive, and you can kind of just tap one and go into it and change any of those settings that you would want. So if you do decide you want to use manual mode, I just want to explain it, just because there's one situation where I think you guys might actually use it. But if you do want to use it, as I said before, you want to start with an ISO. That's the lowest number, so you have the best quality. You want to determine whether you want the depth of field or motion blur to be the priority. So if you say, if you want to freeze those cars, you just turn up your shutter speed. The next step is you want to then adjust the other non-ISO setting to try to get the proper exposure, and then only if you can't get the right exposure between these two settings, then you want to increase the ISO. But again, you're not going to want to use this on a normal street. If you're just walking around doing a site visit, you're not going to want to use it. But one situation, if you're maybe doing a website photo, is using this for what they call HDR, and that stands for high dynamic range. And the gist of this is that the camera can only really capture so many ranges of light between like the shadows and brights, especially if they're in the same picture. And so a lot of times you're going to either get the sky that's blown out, it's too white, or you're going to have silhouettes, everything's going to be too dark. It can't really capture what our eyes can capture in one photo. So the idea of this is that you take multiple pictures at varying brightnesses, and then you combine them later, and it kind of takes the best of all those pictures. The iPhones actually have, in the iPhones they say the HDR mode. It actually does that. It doesn't do it as well as doing it manually, but it does actually take 3 pictures and tries to combine them for that same thing. So this is a kind of a common thing. Doing it manually, though, is going to give you a lot better results than what like the iPhone or the built-in features do, though. So this is another one that you need a tripod for, but you would put the camera on a tripod because you need all your pictures to line up exactly the same. You go to the manual mode. You're going to set your ISO to 100 ideally, and then you're going to set your desired aperture. And basically, the ISO just needs to be off of auto because you don't want it. You can turn your ISO to auto and it'll kind of adjust for you, but you want to turn that off just so you have complete control of the exposure here. And then if you're doing a landscape shot, you just turn your aperture to a higher number or something. But then after those two are set, you take anywhere from 3 to 5 pictures with varying shutter speeds, and you want to go from a couple that are too dark, some that are right in the middle, and then a couple that are too bright. And you're going to have a series of pictures, and then you can bring those. And we have Photoshop on the workstation computer here, and you can go in there and kind of combine them to make one single HDR shot that's going to kind of give you give you a complete picture there. I know how to do this. Antonio said he'd be willing to learn, and because he's familiar with Photoshop, and he can kind of show you. So if you guys go out in the field and decide you want to try this, you can take the pictures and we'll kind of put them together for you. But I have an example for you. This is from, I went out last fall to watch a sunrise, and this is one situation where the camera's not going to, and I'm sure everyone's trying to take a picture of a sunset before, and it just does not look the way that you remember it. And when the sun's low is one situation that the camera struggles with. So took 4 different pictures on a tripod there. The first one's obviously too bright, but the grass there from the marsh, that's pretty much how I saw it. There's plenty of light for me to see it, and so that's how it looked to me. But the sky looked more like that last picture, where it was like, just bright orange and pink. And if you were to take a single picture with auto, it's probably going to give you something in between the second and third picture there. It's going to find something in the middle for you. So what you do is you take a series of pictures and make sure they're all lined up, and then you bring them to Photoshop. You can put them together, and it's going to combine them into one picture and kind of give you the best of everything. So you're going to be able to see everything in the front. You're going to see the skies from the other picture, and so this is something that if we're doing an as-built or a marketing shot or something like that, this might be, we want to get a nice dusk picture or something like that. This would be a good technique for that, where you can kind of light everything properly without getting too many shadows or blown out skies. And I did another example here just the other day. This is just a pedestrian tunnel by my house. But the upper left picture is just, that's actually on auto mode with this camera, so that's pretty much what it's going to give you. And then I took a couple additional photos there that kind of brightened up that tunnel a little bit, and then kind of combined the two. And you can say, again, that upper left one is the auto photo, and then when you put them together as an HDR, you kind of can see a little bit more detail there in the tunnel. So, some people don't like these. They say, say it looks a little fake, but it is a method that people use. It's something that you can kind of get some better pictures if you have a lot of dark, shadowy areas, and it typically looks a little bit better than just going into Photoshop and brightening things up artificially.
Especially if there are details yet that you want to take a look at.
What was that?
Especially if there are a lot of details that you want to
Right.
Be able to look up later.
Right. Yeah. So like and this is one situation where if you're like underneath a bridge or something where you have bright and dark areas that the camera kind of has to pick a side and decide what it's going to be exposing for. And this is a way but again, you kind of need it on a tripod, or you can put it on a park bench or something like that if you have the ability to do that. And if you take a couple pictures, then we can kind of throw them together, and you have one picture that kind of gives you a little better full photo than what you're going to get with any single photo.
The camera itself can't do the HDR?
It actually does have, in the auto mode, there's a backlit feature. It's actually the last one of the auto, and it has a picture of a kind of an outline of a guy with the sun right behind his shoulder. And that one does take 3 pictures. That was something that's in I was going to say with the auto modes, you can kind of look through it. It doesn't do it as well as the manual mode, but it will, if you're in that situation, you can try it with that auto mode. But it's the same principle where you actually, I'll show you real quick what it sounds like. But when you do it, it's going to take 3 pictures real quick by itself. So let's see here if you mind me taking a picture of you at the time.
Don't break the camera.
All right. I'm going to do a no flash auto here. Well, that was actually not too bad. You're very photogenic, Tom.
Cute.
Yeah.
Not so much.
But it does take a little time to kind of process them. But
You were already combine them in the camera?
yeah, it'll kind of do it by itself. But in this example, like I'm kind of, it doesn't really look that much difference. It kind of brightened up the wall behind your shoulders a little bit. But I've tried it. There are some situations where that auto works, that auto mode is helpful, but it's not going to give you the same results, especially if it's something where the sun's low.
So it has to be in the manual? Like if I take it in the TV or the AV gold?
Mm-hmm. Well, any of those modes will work as well. Well, I'm sorry. You actually do have to be in the full manual to do that, because the thing is, if you're in the aperture mode, you basically don't have control of the shutter speed. You control the aperture, and it's automatically going to adjust that to try to give you the proper exposure. So if you try to, turn it down to get a dark picture, it's going to correct it for you, because it thinks, no, that's going to be too dark. And so it's going to correct those settings to give you that middle exposure all the time. So the only way you can actually intentionally take a picture that's too dark or too bright is to go in the manual mode. Otherwise, the camera's going to try
So
to.
in the manual mode, then we control the shutter speed to get a range of the lightness of the picture, and then use the software to combine them.
Right.
And then we can just pick, like if we take 10 pictures.
Yeah, you can.
just
You only
pick
really
one.
need 3. You know, one in the middle, and then one that's too bright, one's too dark. But I mean, I've put 5 or 6 together before. It's but yeah, just 3 is really all you need. Even that one at the tunnel, I basically took the middle one and just did a couple that were brighter because there's really no need to darken it anymore for what I was doing. So it's really just depends on the need.
Besides Photoshop, is there any other software that can do that? Or
There's a separate program called Photomatics, but it's not a free program. It's probably like
does
50 years.
Lightroom do?
No, Lightroom doesn't. No, I don't think it does. Not that I'm aware of, because you have to kind of combine different layers, and Lightroom doesn't have layers. But we do have the full version of Photoshop, so you can do it here. But yeah, full manual mode is kind of the only way to do that, by yourself. So I know I went through that quick. No, people aren't going to be able to do this. I'm not expecting them to walk out of here and be completely comfortable doing all this. But is there any other questions in regards to just any uses for this or any of these settings or anything? No. Okay, so the last thing, now that you guys are experts in that, want to go over just some composition tips, and these are things that will help us here in the office, but you can also maybe take them on your next vacation and take some better shots there. Composition just describes the placement of objects or elements in a photo, and most photos, if you see a good picture in a magazine or in a billboard or whatever, a lot of those are very thought out, and they're not just some guy who's in the right place at the right time and happens to have a fancy camera. They're all, a lot of these shots that people are getting paid for, a lot of thought goes into them. The same way when we put a plan set together, we put a lot of thought into like what scale we're going to put it at, where something's going to be in the photo or on the sheet, what reference files we're going to have, what callouts we're going to use, all that. It's kind of the same thing where when a professional's taking a picture, there's a lot of thought of like where you're going to stand, what time you're going to be there, what you're going to include the photo, what you're going to try to eliminate things out of the background. A lot of nature shots are actually staged. Like if you see a picture of a sunset, people will kind of move. If there's leaves in the way, they'll get all the leaves out of the picture. So there's no, there's a lot of things that they're like, oh, how do they come to this perfect, this riverbed that has like it's completely immaculate? It's like, well, they probably cleaned it off when they got there and then waited for it. So there's a lot of things that go into these photos, and it's not Yeah, so I mean, but the same thing should go for us if you're going to do, if we're doing these field visits and you're just doing a survey of something that, obviously you don't need to do that much thought. But if you're taking a shot for a website or an as-built for something like that, it does kind of pay to go through and actually put some thought into your photos. So it's going to kind of cover some of those things here. So each photo should be, kind of be thought out and have a purpose and be planned. And here's some of the questions you should kind of ask yourself when you're taking the picture. Just like I said, what are you actually taking a picture of? Is it going to be clear to whoever looks at your photo what you're taking a picture of? Where's the subject going to be within the frame? Where are you going to stand? What angle are you going to be taking the picture? When are you going to be taking the picture? And what's going to be in the background? So to go over those briefly, what is the subject? So here's a picture of, got all these photos off of Google, by the way, so they're just random pictures. But, if you look at this picture, it's not necessarily, at least for me, it's not necessarily clear what you're taking a picture of. This might be someone who's just visiting Big Ben and they want a picture of Big Ben, but it might be the friend of the guy in the lower right, and maybe the guy wanted his picture in front of Big Ben. Or maybe it's somebody that works for the city and they're doing a sidewalk survey and they're trying to show that this is the sidewalk in front of Big Ben. But it's not necessarily clear, and there's maybe some things you could do if they are taking a picture of just Big Ben or the sidewalk. Maybe you could allow those people to get out of the picture before you take the picture, just to make it clear that that's in fact what you're taking a picture of. Or if it's the picture of the person, here's an example of someone else who did it, and that's a pretty clear subject where that's a picture of the girl in front of Big Ben. There's not really any guesswork of whether that girl's supposed to be in the picture or not. So it's kind of the same way of just make sure that someone looking at it knows exactly what you're taking the picture of, what you're supposed to be portraying in your photo. And the next one's where is the subject within the picture, within the frame. And a lot of people just by default just put whatever you're taking a picture of right in the middle of the picture, and it's probably just because you don't really know where else to put it. But one of the most common things that's absolutely everywhere if you start looking for it is called the rule of thirds. And there's this tic-tac-toe grid. It's actually built into your iPhone if you guys have an iPhone, and a lot of other cameras. If you just go into your settings and turn on your grid, this will be shown over your camera, and the idea of it is that I guess it's been used for centuries, but they've done studies where basically at the intersection of these lines where the red dots are, that's kind of where people naturally tend to look when they look at a photo, that their eyes are just drawn to those locations. So you kind of want to put your focal point or your subject at one of those locations, and it's kind of just going to make the photo more appealing to the person looking at it. So to do this, you just put the grid over your frame, and then you put your focal point near any of those intersections, like I said. And here's one example where you take a picture of this lighthouse, and instead of just putting the lighthouse in the middle, you kind of shift it off to the side. And it just kind of tells a little bit more of a story than putting it in the middle. And another rule is just that the horizon should usually be on one of those third lines, either the lower or upper third, versus putting the horizon right in the middle. Again, it's just one of those things that's done studies, and it's just visually more appealing to put it on one of those locations. And usually that's determined by what you're taking a picture of. If you're taking a picture, in this case, like it's an ocean or if it's a mountain range or something, if the sky is what's attracting you, if there's a lot of clouds, then you might want to put on the lower third so you can get more of the sky involved. If it's more of the mountain with a lake in front of it, then you might want to scoot it up to the top and put the horizon on the top third and kind of focus on what's down below. In this case, they obviously wanted to include the clouds, so they kind of put it on the lower portion. And here's just a picture of a boat that someone just put it right in the middle, kind of the horizon's in the middle, and it's not a bad picture. It's just a boat out there in the ocean. But if you put it on the third, put the boat over to on one of these focal points, it just kind of gives you a little space in front of the boat. It kind of tells a little bit more of a story, kind of portrays motion, that there's room in front of the boat for it to move, and it just kind of again, just more of a visually appealing photo. And again, this is art. And everyone has the right to have their own opinion, and if you like the boat in the middle, you're not wrong for doing that. I'm just saying that if this is just the first, one of the common things they tell you, that if you just put the boat there because you didn't know where else to put it, then maybe you should think about if there's any other places. And but if you actually like it there, it's definitely fine. It's just kind of showing you that you should kind of, going back to the whole, you should put thought into your photo, and it should be there. If it's in the middle, it should be there for a reason, kind of thing. So here's some examples of other photos that just use the rule of thirds. You kind of have the water treatment plant. You have the bridge that kind of uses both the horizontal and vertical lines there. The picture, that lower picture is actually, I got that off Google, but that's apparently from the HDR website. That's one of their marketing photos. But when you're taking a picture of a person, the focal point, when you look at a person, you're supposed to look at them in the eye, so people are naturally drawn to people's eyes. So taking a picture of a person, you want their eyes to be on that focal point, and you can kind of see that person's head's kind of right there at that rule of thirds. Here's a couple other examples. Again, we have the beam there on the lower right, and we have the gentleman's eyes on the upper right. And for the interchange, a lot of people take a picture of interchange from the top, and it's just kind of right in the middle. In this case, they use the intersecting street there, kind of at that horizontal rule of thirds there on the top. So it's just kind of a different placement where it's kind of everywhere. And like I said, you'll see it on billboards and TV shows and movies, advertisements everywhere. So once you start looking for it, you'll notice it's a pretty common technique. But you can still use things in the middle. Just, again, you need to have a reason for it. So using symmetry is one of those purposes where you can kind of still have the focal point in the middle. If it makes sense to do that, some of these work. If there's something that's kind of mirrored, or it kind of leads you into the middle, or that situation is one where it's there for a reason. There's a purpose for it to be having the focal point in the middle there. Then where will you stand? Here's a couple pictures of the Golden Gate Bridge, and obviously they're all very nice pictures, and they're all different from different locations. So when you're taking a picture of something, don't always just get out of the car and take the first picture that right where you're standing. Maybe it'll look better if you cross the street or walk a block away or something. So if you're visiting a new city and you see a big building, don't just pull out your camera and take a picture right where you're standing. Maybe wait for someone to cross the street, like I said, or get a little bit closer, or wait for the people to get out of the way so there's nothing distracting in your photo. And then when will you be there? That's a very those two pictures are pretty much from the same spot, but the one was taken in the middle of the day, the other one was taken in the evening. So if we're doing a marketing photo and maybe we installed lights where there previously were no lights, if you're doing an as-built or a marketing photo for that, maybe you'd want to go at dusk instead of doing a visit in the middle of the day, and make sure that you get those lights into that photo. And then from what angle? Here's another example of just, these might be just survey shots of a parking lot that you're going to be working on, or an intersection, and you just kind of got out of your car. It looks like a good spot. You can see the street lights and the signs, and you kind of know where you're going. But you can kind of look around. There might be another angle that would portray it a little bit better. Maybe you can find a parking garage or a public building that you can get up on and look down. Those aren't always there, but maybe sometimes even just getting up on a bus stop bench or something to get a little bit elevated view will kind of give you a better picture, or you can kind of maybe see over the cars. So just something to think about if you're out there. Is there, if you're trying to get a good shot to represent something, is there a better angle to take that picture? And what is or isn't in the background? So luckily we have a professional portrait photographer here for when we all get hired that doesn't do this kind of thing, but it's pretty easy to get distracted on what you're taking a picture of and not really look for the background. And you just don't want to do that. You want to make sure that yes, you're putting the person where you want them, or the subject where you want it in the photo, and you got the settings right and all that. It's just it's a whole kind of photo bomb situation where you just want to make sure there's nothing distracting in the background. And in the same sense, sometimes you need something in the background. In this case, if you're doing sidewalk survey, and maybe you go out there and take a picture of the sidewalk and say, yeah, this is the picture of the sidewalk that's broken. But if someone's looking at this picture, it really doesn't give them a lot of information. So in some cases, you actually want to add things to the background for reference. So these other examples are, maybe take a picture of the cracked sidewalk with where you can see the house numbers, so you kind of know where on the street this is. Or in the other picture there on the lower right, you can kind of see a reference where you can kind of see the McDonald's or the street light there. We can kind of give an approximate distance from the intersection to just so people kind of know what that is instead of just looking straight down on a cracked sidewalk. It's just something to think about when you're out there. Just if someone's looking at this project, a few months from now and is not familiar with it, are they going to know what this represents? And then some other ideas, just real quick, just some other ideas if you're looking for something to get a creative shot, is using reflections. Here's a couple examples of reflections that you could use. Leading lines, there's lines all over the place, and they tend to, the reason you'd use this is it tends to lead the viewer's eyes through the photo. It kind of gets you intrigued, and you kind of follow the lines to the focal point. If you use them the right way, it can really add a lot to the photo. So here's a couple other examples where people use lines, and as you see from the lower right, it doesn't have to be a straight line. An S-curve is a pretty visually appealing element that people use a lot. And you just kind of guide your eyes through the photo and keeps you intrigued for just that extra half second while you're looking at it, and just makes that more interesting. And then patterns. Patterns is something that everybody recognizes, so therefore it's something that's good to put into a photo. It's just if you see any kind of repeating pattern, it's just something that everyone can kind of relate to. So if you're looking for something, that's just another idea of something to look for when you're out on the site. And then here's just a website that I use that has a lot of really good articles. This PowerPoint's going to be available for printout if you guys want to visit this website or anything. But they have a lot of really good articles about composition and really everything related to photography. But if you want to read about any more of those things that I just talked about, some pretty good websites there. And if you just want some practice on taking better pictures, here's just a couple quick practice things you can do. Is you can just take one object while you're at home and just try to take 10 different pictures of it from different angles, from different lights, looking down on it, looking up on it. And after 4 or 5, you're going to realize you're kind of running out of ideas pretty quick. And so it kind of really makes you think about different ways to take the pictures. You don't take the same picture of every single thing that you take a picture of. And you might find that the 7th or 8th way that you take a picture that you've never thought of before might be your favorite picture. So if you're trying to just work on your creativity, that's one thing you can do. You can go on a walk and just pick a theme. Look for patterns or reflections. Say, I'm just going to go on this walk and I'm just going to look for nothing but reflections, and you'll find it in mirrors and windows and puddles and everything. So you can just find things where go on a walk for an hour and just look for a certain color. Look for the color blue and just take pictures of everything that's blue. And you'll just kind of train your eyes to look for those types of things. So next time when you're out there looking for other, just not necessarily looking for that, and in particular, maybe all of a sudden those patterns are jumping out at you. And then the last thing is just go out and basically limit yourself to the number of photos. If you're going to go out on a walk, we're so used to this digital age where you can take 100 pictures, and I'm as guilty as anyone of taking more pictures than you need to. And it's just that you don't really put much thought into it, because you can take 100 pictures, and if one of them turns out, you're fine. But if you really limit it to it, pretend like you have film in your camera and you only have 10 shots to take, is go out there and it's going to really force you to put some thought into your photo and make sure that you don't just take one, hoping one, take a bunch, hope one comes out good. That you actually put thought into it and make sure that that one photo you're going to take is actually going to be worth the shot. So that was a lot of information, but any other questions?
Are you going to teach us using Photoshop to do the, what is that called?
The HDR. Yeah, I can. It's just there's a it's basically just a pull down mode, and I think you say merge to HDR. So you just go into Photoshop. It'll say what photos you want to upload, and then you just select the 3 or 5 pictures. And it'll basically stack them all in there for you.
Oh, so we don't have to position ourselves.
No, that's what it'll kind of. That's why they have to be on a tripod, because they have to kind of all be lined up, and it'll stack them all on there. It'll kind of scan and automatically do it. So, but yeah, I can. If anyone's interested in that, I can kind of show you on the workstation there if you want to. But
Does that pick like best features of each? Like how does it?
It generally goes by brightnesses. Like it just if one thing I didn't really cover is there's a histogram graph that kind of shows the brightnesses, and when things get to the black side, it's called clipping. And if everything gets like so bright that it's just a solid white and you can't correct it, like those are called clipping areas. So it basically looks for the whites and the blacks, and then assumes the blacks are too dark, and then it looks for one of the other photos that is not black in that location and uses that. So it basically just tries to get rid of all the really bright and really dark spots in the photo. The only problem with that is that you sometimes get like a lower contrast photo, which sometimes you might want to do a color correction afterwards just to kind of tweak it, just because it tends to not have any of the highlights or dark areas. So you might want to kind of tweak it after you get to it, just because there are actually shadows and bright spots and dark spots in the picture, but it tends to kind of find everything in the middle. So you might have kind of a gray cast on the picture. But yeah, it's a pretty nifty tool. It can definitely be overdone. If you Google HDR photos, you'll see a lot of really crazy colors and people that do it. It can be really neat, but some of them look completely fake, and it's really kind of a fine line of getting just like a kind of a realistic photo versus something that looks completely manufactured in Photoshop. So
Does Photoshop take raw pictures or?
yes,
Oh.
it has a separate program called Camera Raw. It should be built in. It'd be a full version of Photoshop, right? Yeah. So, and what Janice is talking about is you can switch the file format that these cameras save in. It's normally, I think we probably just have it set for JPEG, which is what most cameras are going to save something as. You can also, basically, when a camera takes a picture, it's going to absorb all the information, and it's going to, save all the brights and all the darks and everything. And it's going to actually kind of tweak the picture to whatever settings you have. So like I said, if you go to landscape mode, it's going to want to sharpen the picture. It's going to want to turn on a certain aperture. It's going to want to enrich some of those colors a little bit more. But it's going to process the pictures on whatever settings you might have it for, and just the general auto mode kind of has its own settings. So anyways, it's going to absorb all this information, process it to what it thinks a good JPEG is going to look like, and then saves those changes as a JPEG. You also have the option of saving a RAW file, and what that does is it saves all the information that it just took the picture of, and it also gives you that JPEG preview, but it's going to save a much bigger file called a RAW file that has all that. And so if you want to, basically what that's good for is if you're going to be doing a lot of editing with the photos, you have the original photo that has a lot more information. You have a lot more room to brighten or darken the photo without kind of losing quality. Because it might take a photo and automatically darken it a little bit, or brighten or darken it in certain areas, and then saves it. And then once it's saved, now if you try to bring it back, you're kind of doing a destructive change. Whereas if you have that full range of availability there and the tweaks with the RAW file, then you can kind of do a little bit more manipulation with the files. But they are really big files. If you start taking every picture in RAW, you're going to fill up your card pretty quick. So it's probably not, if you're taking like a marketing photo, you're going to go out there and get 1 or 2 good photos. It's probably not a bad idea to do. But for our purposes, JPEGs are probably going to do just fine. So, anything else? Everybody's a pro now. Got a year and a half of information, like an hour.
Yeah, that was really good. That was a good.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Well,
Good. Glad it helped.
Gonna take a field trip down and go take photos.
Yeah.
Now everybody.
Yeah. Let's go on a walk.
Oh, I'm so excited that you did this Photoshop.